Hey everyone, welcome back to the 443 Security Simplified. I'm your host, Mark Liberty, and joining me today is...
Corey exit node knockreiner. I'm where all the crap comes out of.
Wow, that is way accurate. On today's episode...
That's what I get for self-deprecating humor, immediate confirmation.
We will be de-anonymizing the TOR network, or at least discussing the story about how one government managed to do that. We'll then have a chat about banning even more China-based technology, this time in our cars. And we will end with a cool research post on chaining some low-severity vulnerabilities into a medium-severity vulnerability in a pretty interesting way. With that, though, let's go ahead and relay our way in.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. So last week, there was a really interesting story that kind of, at least on like the InfoSec social media areas that I still follow, which is basically exclusively Reddit at this point. It originally set off alarm bells for folks when this story popped up, because the headlines for this was basically that German law enforcement had de-anonymized the TOR network. The TOR,
go ahead.
The TOR network is, the dark web, meaning the application/system for protected internet services to both access dark web hidden services as well as just protect normal users' internet browsing to normal internet websites through this ecosystem too. It's
essentially just a peer-to-peer network, right? So it stands for the onion routing or the onion relay. And it's essentially using peer-to-peer, but some peers can act as very specialized exit nodes. But I'm oversimplifying it, sure, Mark. But by having multiple hops between lots of peers, your actual traffic comes out of exit node that's hopped through all kinds of other peers before it gets there, with, of course, cryptography and encryption on top of it.
Yeah.
And I guess it was it the U.S. Navy? It was like research U.S. groups that first made it to help get past the Great Firewall of China. It was made as a part of, fight for freedom and open information to people that may be receiving censored information online.
Yeah, it was originally created by the U.S. Naval Laboratory. I'm not British. Now it is owned by the TOR Project, which is a nonprofit that still gets a lot of funding from the U.S. federal government, but it is technically independent. And let's real quickly go over how the TOR network works at a high level. It gets more complicated when you talk about accessing what are called hidden services, like dark web websites. But if you're just using it to access a regular website to protect your anonymity as you're browsing the internet, it's a little more simple. So the map Corey's showing on the video right now is a map of a whole bunch of different types of relays, or relay nodes is what it's called. And the goal for the TOR network is so no outside observer or the destination like web server itself can associate a connection with the original user. So like if I connect to superillegalwebsite.com, or let's use a better example. If I'm a journalist in like Saudi Arabia and I'm connecting to a journalist website, I want to protect my identity so I don't get buzzsawed to death by an oppressive government over there.
Or if you're going to unalienablehumanrights.org from China, you might actually get to that site instead of a blank page saying this doesn't exist here.
So it works by having a collection of nodes that are just deployed around the world, run by some organizations, run by individual hobbyists around the world. These nodes can be...
It could be you to the hobbyist, right? When you set up
Correct.
TOR network, you can actually choose to be one of these. I mean, granted, you're going to get a lot of traffic go through your connection depending on what you pick. So I think it's more likely that someone that is an organization with routing and heavy bandwidth does it. But it could literally be you if you wanted.
And so, like Corey, you hinted at, there's actually three different types of nodes that participate in this network. So there's something called the entry guard, which is a protected type of node that's responsible for your client will build a connection to this one first, and that's how you enter into the network. There's the exit relay, which is where your connection will exit the network and go to whatever actual website you're trying to visit. And then in between those are middle relay nodes, which is basically anything that's used as that hop in between the guard and the exit. If you want to join the Tor network and participate and set up your own node, you can set up a middle relay, as it's called, and you won't have any risk of like illegal traffic exiting your IP address. It's just a bandwidth usage at that point. The exit nodes are the ones where technically, like, any activity that people are sending over the Tor network could exit out of your node. And so could be journalists getting access to their publication websites, or it could be people doing super illegal stuff. And so you'll need to fight with your ISP. And the Tor project has, like, I don't know what the right, like, template responses. You can work with your ISP for this too, to kind of protect you. But at the end of the day, it's still, I don't know, I'd say it isn't without risk running an exit relay.
And essentially, the exit nodes can be publicly known by IP address. There might be encryption and things that, unless you're an ISP, you're not going to see all the traffic where it's going from an exit node. But we know the world knows what the exit nodes are. So if you see something going to or from an exit node, it could be potentially Tor. It is Tor related, and it could be potentially bad or benign. Hard to know.
I mean, the reality is we know every single node on the Tor network. Like this map that you're showing on the video is literally every node on the Tor network, because you need to know their IP address in order to build this relay through them. So what happens when, let's say, you boot up the Tor web browser and you want to go visit the NewYorkTimes.com to go get news while you're overseeing an oppressive country. Your web browser, the Tor web browser, starts by picking a guard relay. And this guard relay, typically you'll use the same one for like months in a row until there's an issue with it that causes you to switch to another one. And it will build a encrypted connection to that guard relay. It then tells that guard to build a encrypted connection to a middle relay that it picks randomly for the connection it's building just right then and there. So at this point, that entry guard, it knows both your computer's, your client's IP address, and it knows the middle relay that you're talking to, but nothing else. That middle relay knows the guard that's connecting to it, but it can't see the hop on the other side of the guard. So now that middle relay has no idea what client is connected to it. It just knows the guard it is connected to. Then through that tunnel to that middle relay, the Tor browser instructs the middle relay to build a connection to the exit relay or the exit node. So now that middle relay knows it's connected to this guard and this exit, but it has no idea what's going on between that tunnel. The exit only knows the middle relay that's connected to it, but not the guard or the original client. This is actually where like the Tor name or idea comes from, because it's basically layers of an onion, layers of encryption that you're peeling off through this tunnel, where one layer only knows the two that are touching it and nothing else in between it or above it.
And that includes your traffic too, right? So other is technically everything passing through other. It knows the guard it's coming through and it knows the exit it's going to, but it doesn't know what the contents are. Exactly. The only one that might be able to see, like the guard has a directly encrypted connection to you, but it doesn't, once it passes off to other, it kind of slowly disappears by its knowledge of where it goes until it gets out the exit.
So the guard relay, it in theory could know like what you're trying to connect to from you as the client. The exit node obviously knows the website you're trying to go to because it has to actually make that final connection, but nothing in the middle knows both of those details, and neither the guard or the exit knows the other end of it. And so this is how that anonymity is built, where an outside observer that compromises like one of these endpoints, like a subpoena for the destination web server or the guard or one other one, doesn't have enough information to figure out fully like who is talking to what on the other end of that tunnel. That's the 10,000 foot level for how the Tor network works. But it's important to understand that compromising one single piece of this isn't enough to really break the anonymity of the Tor network. So this is why it was surprising when that news story came out saying that German law enforcement had arrested and successfully prosecuted a few individuals back in, I think it was 2021 even, is when it actually happened, by de-anonymizing their activity on the Tor network. So the Tor network, it's built of around like 8,000 Tor nodes around the world. 2,200 of them are actually in Germany itself too. And so in theory, like German law enforcement could issue a subpoena for any of these nodes that exist in Germany and start monitoring like the connections going through it, at least the metadata. They wouldn't have access to the like actual web request, depending on which node they went after, but they could monitor the volume of the traffic, the timing of the traffic going through it. Corey did successfully locate the country of Germany. And so you can see that on the map, at least on the video for this podcast.
Light blue.
So the news article says that German law enforcement focused on this chat service that runs on the Tor network. So it's not like accessing a website. It's actually an instant messaging service called Ricochet that uses the Tor network to protect the identity, to protect the IP addresses of people that communicate with each other in this chat app. And that they de-anonymized the participants in this chat app by using something called timing analysis. So to explain that, like, let's picture the extreme example where law enforcement has compromised both the guard relay and the exit relay. So they have visibility into both of those. They could monitor connections coming into the guard relay. They could monitor connections going out of the guard relay. So if they see like 1 megabyte coming into the guard and 1 megabyte leaving the exit node, they can with reasonable certainty assume that, oh, this client that sent 1 megabyte is actually that 1 megabyte going to illegalwebsite.com, for example. And just like one single instance of that probably isn't enough to hold up in court. But if you can establish a pattern of this one client, we can associate with reasonable certainty like these connections with them going to this illegal website on the other end and build up a pattern of this. That probably can hold up in court, and clearly did, because they were able to prosecute someone in this case. Now, that's an extreme example.
By the way, it did require one for the bad actors to go to a place that was known by law enforcement, the chat app. And also, I think, just JavaScript help. I know, like, one of the things, especially if you get Tor browser, you know, people, the Tor organization reminds you that Tor browser alone is not enough to protect yourself. The second you allow JavaScript, you're allowing code from a website to run on your client. So everything you've done to anonymize yourself can likely be reversed by JavaScript that might be able to run local code and identify things like your actual IP, or at least the private one, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep. So that example was the extreme one where they would need to know both the guard and the exit relay. And that's probably pretty rare, because remember, there's 8,000 different nodes. Your computer will use the same guard for like months at a time.
Most of the time.
But every single like destination you try and go access, it'll set up an entirely separate relay, meaning a separate middle node and a separate exit node to get there. So the chances of like German law enforcement to get both the guard and the exit for a specific connection between a specific client and a specific destination, that's very difficult without other vulnerabilities or weaknesses somewhere in the process.
Yep.
What the Tor network owners or the Tor project released in a publication after this news story came out, trying to explain what was going on, is they said, first off, none of the details were shared with them. They're having to go based off of just public information and not the specific details from the specific incident. But what they think happened was German law enforcement conducted what's called a guard discovery attack, which let them discover the guard that this criminal, let's say, because they were tried and convicted in court, they found the guard that the criminal was using, and then they were able to subpoena that guard to start capturing network traffic on the guard. And they presumably already had subpoenaed access to like the malicious or the illegal web server that the criminal was connecting to. So like, let's say an example for a guard attack, let's say law enforcement, they're already monitoring an illegal website, but they don't know which guard they need to go after for the court order to figure out what the client is connecting through. So again, because your Tor browser will always use the same guard for every connection, this is normally fine because it should, in theory, be impossible to map a user to their guard. But what law enforcement can do is if they also control a website that you regularly visit over the Tor network, or if they can trick you into visiting a site they control through like a phishing attack or something like that.
Which could have the JavaScript. Yeah,
exactly. And if the law enforcement owns a number of middle relays somewhere in the middle there, which they can advertise like a high bandwidth middle relay to make it more probable that your client will pick that relay to build the actual connection. What they can do is on that website they control, they can use JavaScript, like you just suggested, to just make a ton of connections behind the scenes to different destinations that don't exist. So they should all return a 404 response. Now, if law enforcement owns a middle relay, they're not going to be able to see the actual like 404 does not exist response, but they will know that there will be like a 40 something byte response packet
tiny
coming back.
response, very likely compared to a normal one.
Exactly. So each new connection that this JavaScript creates will use a new relay. It'll build a new path to the destination. And with enough time, it will eventually make a connection to a middle relay, or that includes a middle relay under law enforcement's control. So if they sit there and monitor and they can correlate their request through JavaScript with, oh, now we see that 44 byte packet come back, maybe do that a few different times to get like a good assumption that they've mapped that out. Now, because they know the middle relay, they can see, okay, for that response back, we know it was using this guard to handle the request. And we can assume that it was our client connecting through it because we have control over the connections they were making.
Yeah.
So now they know the guard that client is using. And if that guard exists in Germany, which with 2,000 different nodes in there, there's a decent chance it does. And because it's local to that user, there's a decent chance it does. Now they can go get a court order and say, hey, we have, I don't know what the German equivalent of like probable cause is, but we have probable cause that this user is connecting through this relay. Here's our court order. We want to start monitoring the network traffic that goes through this relay. And they give that to the ISP in front of it or the data center that hosts it or whatever. So they still can't see the actual content of the web request going to this, but now they can monitor the actual network traffic going through it. And they can do that timing analysis where they see a connection come in from this IP address for 10 megabytes. They see it leave the Tor network on the other end and hit the illegal web server, 10 megabytes. Do enough of that over time, and they can build up a correlation that this client is using this illegal web service.
Likely this user.
Yeah, and we think it's this user. And that's how they most likely de-anonymize these users. Then went after their residential IP address, ISP, found the actual owner of that, arrested them, tried and convicted them for accessing this pretty gross illegal content in the case of this story.
To your point, by the way, Tor, on the Tor blog, Mark mentioned they did a blog post basically with their response to how this probably happened, and they agree with that whole ricochet timing attack is the likely reason. So if you go to Tor's blog page, it's called "Is Tor Still Safe to Use?" and you can read the Tor project's response to all of this and how they think it happened, as well as what you can maybe do to protect yourself from specifically ricochet, at least the version in question.
So they pointed to, they believe that the criminal in this case was using an old version of Ricochet that's actually been deprecated over time. There's a new rebooted version of Ricochet called Ricochet Refresh, which includes some of Tor's protections that they have against guard discovery attacks. So one of those protections is called, uses the Vanguard protocol, which was not available in that older version of Ricochet, but is in the newer ones and is available in just the normal Tor web browser for traffic. Vanguard at a high level, what it does is it adds 2 additional relays. They're called Vanguard relays between the guard and the middle relay, which makes it more difficult to execute one of those guard discovery attacks, more difficult to get that path directly through your relay in a way that lets you de-anonymize it. Partially because only a very specific, like protected, restricted set of Vanguard nodes can actually be chosen as those. These are basically like known good servers that the Tor project trusts. Maybe they're in regions where they can't be reached by law enforcement. Maybe they're protected in some other way, but it at least makes it more difficult to do one of these guard discovery attacks. Another thing that the Tor project always talks about, I actually went to one of their talks at, I think it was DEF CON this year, about trying to gather metrics on the Tor network, which gathering metrics from a private network seems a little funky, but they were talking about how they can get those metrics in a way that still protects privacy. But one of their talking points was like one of the best ways to protect traffic on the Tor network is to participate in the Tor network as a user. So either
Your
you
whole
using
point
the
about
network,
8,000 nodes, like if we
yep,
could double that, that alone is more protection. So that does require more of the normal people, like we talked about earlier, turning on the ability to be one of the relays.
yep. The more legitimate, non-malicious, non-compromised nodes out there, the more or the less likely a relay will be built with one of those nefarious or compromised nodes. Also, the more users there are just in general, the more difficult it is to do traffic analysis on those connections. And again, we're talking about this in the context of a story of people that were doing illegal, gross stuff using the Tor network. But at the same time, this network does protect legitimate and like noble
Journalists
causes
too.
around the world too. And
It's one of
so
those
there,
benign networks that can be used for bad or good.
yep. And so there is a good reason to protect Tor traffic, at least in my opinion. I understand some people maybe take a hardline approach of if it can be used for bad, it shouldn't be used at all. But my opinion is there are legitimate good uses for the Tor network for journalism, for protecting the United States' own morals around the world that I think it is a network we
Yeah.
should protect.
And the other thing to point out is in this case, it's the authorities trying to do this de-anonymization, but that means bad actors in other nations can do the same, and it means criminals might be able to do the same. So not only does Tor have good uses, but bad people can try to de-anonymize good Tor users too. So it's just in everyone's benefit to
Yep.
allow it to protect people's anonymity online.
So my main takeaway from this whole story, though, was yes, it is possible in some cases to de-anonymize the Tor network if you are using outdated versions of applications, if you are in a region that has a high concentration of Tor nodes that could be law enforcement friendly. But there's a lot of ifs that go into this, where in general, the Tor network is still safe to use in
And a
most
lot of
cases.
the ifs were you ending up going to a known place, in this case, using the Ricochet chat of maybe even an old version for someone to catch you. And by that, I mean, these authorities probably understood the tools, tactics, and procedures of, in this case, pedophiles or whatever, and they knew they used a particular chat network to communicate. They probably knew a board because anyone on Tor could have found out this, and they found a vulnerability specifically. So what I'm getting at is the other thing is if you're doing something bad at a known location on Tor, that's where they're going to catch you too. So if you're using Tor for good, you're probably not going to these known bad places that law enforcement is specifically trying to de-anonymize whoever's going there. And in this case, they needed that vulnerability to exist in Ricochet to figure out who you were.
Yep.
Don't
And
do
if
bad
you
stuff.
let's give the guidance for people that are using Tor for good. And so if you are using Tor for good, like practice good operational security, keep your Tor browser or Ricochet
Up to
applications
date.
updated. Don't use JavaScript. That is one of the
Don't
easiest
enable it.
ways to de-anonymize someone. Yes,
And
that
that's
may
hard,
break
by the way.
some
You're gonna, if
websites.
you go to a normal forum website or whatever, things won't work. But just remember, enabling JavaScript is one of the first ways to lose some
Yep.
anonymity, at least for the site you're visiting.
And we didn't discuss it and probably won't go into details on it in this episode, but most of the, like, let's say legitimate services you might try and access, like let's say again you are a journalist and you're trying to get to the Washington Post, for example, most of these have a hidden services, meaning a dark web version of their site that doesn't have
Onion site.
JavaScript, that is exclusively on the dark web. It never exits into the clear web onto the other legitimate website. So, like, there are
Use
ways
that.
to use it securely that will
Use
better
that one.
protect or reduce the risk of you being exposed for using those services. But it was interesting story. It definitely had a bit of like fear factor from the start, but at the end of the day, it's basic operational security, and you can probably continue using Tor. That said, like one last hot take, Corey, what do you think the chances are that like nation state governments like the US are just collecting all Tor traffic so that when we invent quantum computers, they can break all
They
the
can
encryption and
decrypt
see
it.
where everyone is going?
I would not be surprised. Maybe not all literally, but maybe some people, or maybe some exit nodes where they at least have enough data of where the users are going that they want to, like, yeah. I bet you for certain IP destinations from exit nodes, they are collecting all the traffic to that destination in hopes that one day it will be decryptable.
Maybe as soon as we get the U.S. government quantum computer, we're going to see a wave of arrests for people accessing
What
illegal
is the
content.
statutation of like how long there
The
is? I
statute
forget
of
in the
limitations.
statute of limitations. So will they crack it in time that they can still prosecute?
In some of these cases, like, you know, child sex abuse material, like you mentioned that
Maybe
this
there
story
is
was
none.
about, I'm hoping
Yeah,
there isn't one and they can get
yeah,
them after the fact no matter what. But I don't know, maybe if you're
yeah.
just
I can
buying
agree with
drugs on the
that.
dark web, you're actually safe. Maybe it will take more than 7 years for the government to crack
I don't know, man. Just
crack
avoid doing
encryption.
anything that's illegal, especially something as dangerous and harmful as the horrible stuff we've talked about. You know,
Yep.
that's the stuff giving Tor a bad name.
Sage advice. So next story I want to talk about the U.S. Commerce Department just proposed a national security fueled ban on Chinese and Russian made automobile hardware, specifically hardware that can connect to the outside world, so like Bluetooth interfaces or satellite modules or driverless systems in automobiles. So they pointed to evidence that China has already been pre-positioning malware in critical infrastructure around the United States in preparation for future sabotage. They pointed to evidence from like the FBI and their investigations into like China-based probing into our other critical infrastructure areas.
Pipelines, water grid, etc.
Exactly. And then they pointed to just the risk from automobiles specifically, where cars exist for a long time. Like if you buy a car, maybe you don't own it for the like 10 years, 12 years, but that car will be owned by other people for 10, 15 years or so. And so if a hostile foreign country was able to, let's say, implant malware in one of these devices or set up a backdoor in one of these systems, that could exist for a long enough time that, God forbid, if we did go to war with that hostile foreign country, they could potentially activate that implant or backdoor and disrupt our transportation industry in this case.
And this
It's
might people
interesting.
might think this sounds crazy, but I think we have a non-cyber perfect example of that in pagers. I mean, we can't forget that many countries are intercepting ship. I mean, it's not as dystopian sci-fi as it sounds, right? I mean, they
Yeah, just
intercepted shipments.
ask
The
Hezbollah
FBI's,
about tainted products and services.
yeah, unfortunate. And honestly, I don't know if I love that one because while I'm no fan of Hezbollah, I feel like there was a lot of collateral damage in that, and that would be the same with private cars. But even U.S. governments, tailored operations. One of the code names for an organization in the NSA was known to intercept router delivery to adversarial countries and put implants in them that could be active, 5 years later and turned on, or could be used for espionage. So unfortunately, we do live in a world where I think this is possible. And they've already banned I think it's going to take a few more years to actually be in effect, but they banned DJI drones, they've banned Huawei routers, they've banned Kaspersky antivirus.
This one's interesting where there is a actual like economic reason to do this too that they claim is not one of the driving factors. Like there is a genuine risk to the US auto industry right now from Chinese made cars coming in at $10,000 for a pretty fancy self-driving or at least electric vehicle from China.
And then
It's to
European
the point
markets as
where
well. Yeah.
European markets already seen this. I think there's like 500,000 registered Chinese cars in the European market right now. In the US market, they're already proposing a 100% tariff to try and impact the economics of Chinese cars entering the market. And this could be seen as you know, potentially putting your thumb on the scale from an economic perspective as well, not just a national security one. But, that's the devil's advocate side for it. I do think that there is a legitimate national security concern from cars made like this type of component from China and from Russia, two nations that we are, for better or worse, actually, honestly, for worse, there's no better for this, at odds with right now, where it makes sense to maybe pump the brakes on some of those coming in. So, like,
100%.
I think there are like real concerns from like something that could come from one of these nations interfering with it. There's like, even if it isn't like malicious, even if it's like what the example I'm trying to get to is like Huawei is one where the US government banned Huawei based infrastructure in like our cellular infrastructure and government agencies, not necessarily because they were like intentionally placed implants or stuff in there, but because they were just full of holes. And we couldn't prove without reasonable doubt that China didn't intentionally put them in there or like intentionally turn a blind eye to fixing them.
Well,
And
let me
that could
give
have
you another
introduced
example
weakness.
with DJI drones, right? I mean, one of the things with DJI drones is you have to give it a login, and it's delivered as a feature to the user. But any video you record to the DJI drone is uploaded to their cloud. The same transmission that allows the video to go low resolution to your controller. It's putting it on. I think they call it SkyMap dot whatever, but it's a DJI owned. Like they literally are getting telemetry, like actual live maps of everyone flying the drones. So it's the same type of deal. Like even if the Chinese government doesn't force DJI to do anything with a drone or to take over a drone or put a bug in it, they basically DJI has maps updated of many different places people fly, including the idiots that fly in interesting but places they shouldn't. And that all is available. Those up to date maps could be available to China, and in the same way we use GPS and satellite imagery to get intelligence. It's a form of intelligence they could use even if they never weaponized DJI drones. So I get the risk, and the risk is really we don't. We know that the authoritarian Chinese government has forced their way into companies and forced companies to do things. There may not be any evidence of them doing anything with cars yet, but it really is a lot of capability that's in the hands of the potentially Chinese government through these companies.
So a couple episodes ago, we talked about TP-Link, the really popular consumer network equipment vendor, and how they may be uh, wiped out of the US market because of similar security concerns. And I posed the question at the end of that one of like, where does this end? And it feels like we've got another step now where now it's automobiles too. I'm wondering, like, what are your thoughts, Corey? Do you think we're reaching a place where are we just not going to have any Chinese made electronics at all in the US? I don't think that's possible. We rely
I
on
think it's
Chinese
untenable.
manufacturing for a lot of stuff.
I know everyone has a different opinion of globalization or what they think that means, but I actually think as humanity, we need the diversity of a global economic, supply and demand space. It's good for countries to trade with one another. I do think what has to happen, and this is the hard part that I don't know, is, the same time we talk about just negligent vendors, how the government can have some sort of easy grading system for how secure a company is that helps with buying decisions. We probably need global standards for that, where third parties can validate that this car part doesn't have a back door or something. So it's a hard problem, Mark. I don't think I think it's a slippery slope for countries to keep banning things, because you're just going back to an old school way where countries are adversaries against each other. They're not cooperating to make the world a better place, and everyone loses the diversity of food choice, consumer brands, competition that is actually good for the whole world. We need to figure out how to get the governments out of using normal civilian consumer stuff to fight their wars.
So, and I
Like
think
consumer stuff does not belong in a country's war.
I don't know if this qualifies as a hot take, but I actually think I do support now for areas that we've designated as critical infrastructure for the US, which there are, I think, 18 sectors that we've decided are critical infrastructure. I actually think I do support like technology in those sectors should be US manufactured. We've already designated them. They are critical infrastructure, meaning if something were to happen to their availability or their integrity, it could have like actual damages to national security or societal damages in the US. And so maybe we just should reduce the risk of those sectors and say technology for them, specifically just them, needs to be made in the US. And I think that would be a political win. It would make it more expensive. There would need to be government incentives to help make that actually
Does a
economically
does a car
feasible.
qualify, or is that more like parts in a water, like in nuclear facilities, energy facilities, etc.? Like I can
Transportation
agree
is
with that. I
technically a
can agree
sector.
with that. Yeah.
So, I mean, it depends how ambiguous you want to consider the transportation critical sector. Is that just like logistics of like shipping goods around the world? Because that is important. We need to be able to get food from where it's grown in the US to where it's consumed in the US. Or should that also include personal cars, where if there's an issue with those, it could clog up the transportation system? Like I can see where it does become important, but like you said, it's a slippery slope, and I'm not educated enough to
Well,
know
think
where
about
that
planes.
gray
I mean,
area
even when
ends.
you bring up transportation, the first thing I think of, okay, forget consumer cars. They're not critical. If a person can't get around for a few days, that's fine. But trucks, planes, shipping containers, that's the critical transportation to everyone eating and getting stuff. But the majority of the planes are Boeing, or why can't I think of it? The
Airbus.
European, yeah,
Vive la France.
Airbus. I like. Does that mean countries can't have planes now? Because what would China do about that? I'm sure they have their own plane manufacturer. Although, like, I just think it's. I'm not sure if it will work on an economic level, but there's definitely a risk. I absolutely agree, though, that if we should at least focus, where is the biggest risk? It's critical infrastructure for sure. On the flip side, I could go backwards and say even a off the shelf router, which doesn't support critical infrastructure, can be weaponized in your own country by an external source, and that puts a lot of power when you add up tons and tons of consumer routers. So it really is a crappy issue. I just wish governments would. I think we need a treaty for this type of cyber war. I think we made a prediction long ago that there should be a cyber war treaty, and most war treaties basically, the rules of war typically are leave civilians alone as much as possible. Don't do collateral damage, leave civilians alone. So I just don't think I think governments need to stop backdooring consumer items and limit their warfare to things that we've. And I guess it's like if you have a true adversary, they're never going to agree to the treaty in the first place. But we need to point out what the rules of engagement should be, and collateral damage and targeting civilian stuff just should not be acceptable in any sort of
I
cyber attack.
100% agree. But in reality, if we can't even stop, like, again, Chinese fishing boats from like going and pillaging Philippines oceans, then like,
Yeah.
I don't think we're going to
And now
stop
we
them from
have
hacking
one
our
of
crap.
our allies, doing a physical warfare campaign that's affected many civilians, whatever you
Yep.
think about their true targets. So it's really a touchy area. And it's not fun that the war is, or the world seems to be having more conflicts. So I think
This
it's a
is
problem
why
we'll have to continue to think about.
this is why I'm not in politics, and instead I just take pot shots from my office chair here and
Yeah,
on a
easier to be a
podcast
couch
instead.
quarterback than actually run into plays.
Yep,
For me
exactly.
too.
So either way, I want to move on to the last story, which is actually pretty fun,
This is
and we'll hit
interesting.
this one
Yeah,
quick. So
technical.
the reason this one stood out to me is I help run our bug bounty program at WatchGuard. We get a lot of vulnerability reports for like open redirects, which are generally considered like low severity security issues, if they're even considered a security issue at all. Because like an open redirect on its own, you need to still have a demonstrable security impact for it. Just redirecting from one site to another, yes, it could technically expose someone to like a social engineering attack through there, but it is very low risk. And so this story stood out to me because it actually showed how you could elevate this type of vulnerability into something with quite a bit of a bigger impact. So this starts with a researcher called Lyra that published on their blog last week, walking through an exploit chain they found that starts with a Google document, specifically Google Slides, their PowerPoint equivalent, and how they escalated it into earning a $4,000 bounty on this one by gaining control of arbitrary documents with a one-click exploit. So the
Always
research
start with
starts.
the cat video too.
It's if you look at their blog, like everything about it, they're basically a cat enthusiast slash security researcher. So it starts with them looking at Google Slides, where they found that in Google Slides you can embed a YouTube video in there. And the way it works behind the scenes is Google Slides will take the video ID out of the YouTube embed URL and use that to construct the like embedded video module and stick it in the Google Slide. So all it takes, it discards the YouTube URL, just takes that video ID, and it uses it somewhere else. So the researcher thought, okay, is that untrusted input? Like, how could I potentially abuse this to do something that Google Slides doesn't want me to do? First thing they did was they tested a path traversal, so changing it from an actual video ID to just // to see if they could embed the YouTube homepage in the slides. Turns out that that path traversal technically worked, but YouTube actually has iframe protections that prevent it from being loaded in an iframe somewhere else, which meant they couldn't actually do anything with it. They couldn't find a meaningful vulnerability in there, but it was still an interesting a topic there. So then they pivoted though on, okay, could I find a open redirect in here now, where instead of embedding a video, maybe I can redirect the content that would be embedded to another website, either something under my control as an attacker or another Google website to just get it to do something funky that it shouldn't. So they found, for example, on youtube.com, there's actually a number of redirect URLs on there, open redirect URLs, where one of the parameters in the request path is what YouTube uses to redirect the user to another website. They found though on like the youtube.com like main domain, most of those were actually protected, where before YouTube redirects the user from youtube.com to the other URL, it pops up a little window saying, are you sure that you want to navigate away from YouTube, go to the site or go back to YouTube? And that's a meaningful enough like insertion into the process that it makes it difficult to weaponize that.
If you said yes to this, it would be more your fault for running into it. It gives the user a pretty clear opportunity to back out and at least know the URL that they would be going to, or the domain.
And so they noted it would be difficult to convince someone to click through that. And even if they could, there were still other protections like X-frame options headers set to same origin, meaning a lot of the interactable content wouldn't work. Or you couldn't even load that iframe into there. It would be protected from clickjacking, meaning you could capture the click going onto it to make it to do something else. That said, they found that a subdomain of YouTube, specifically www or even music, or there was like one other in there as well, these subdomains were not protected by a lot of those X-frame options protections or the open redirects. So long story short, they found that by using accounts.youtube or music.youtube or www.youtube, they could control that redirect and cause the page to load something else. So they found one fun example where they could abuse the redirect on accounts.youtube.com to embed the presentation in itself and basically create this like infinite Russian nesting doll of the presentation embedded in the presentation.
Crazy, yeah, Inception. Presentation
Exactly.
Inception.
But even that, it couldn't really be weaponized. It was just a fun little thing. The next thing they looked at, though, was the www subdomain has a sign-in endpoint that doesn't prompt the user for accepting that redirect. And so most of the Google pages have protections around being loaded in an iframe. They've got X-frame options headers that prevent that. But they found a old legacy domain and legacy path that was used for the old like G Suite URLs where they would get loaded in an iframe actually. And so they found a modified URL where they could load a specific file in there and trigger a share request for it, basically, where if you get tricked into loading this URL with a email address already embedded in there and a file already included in the path, it would automatically load up a prompt to share that specific file with that specific email address. So in Corey's video, if he scrolls down just a little bit further, you'll see an example of this where it's actually the URL that's used in like a sharing email. They could abuse that to prompt up and say, do you want to share this file with researcher or whatever? But that's still kind of an obvious, like if you load up a Google slide and suddenly it goes, do you want to share your secret folder with blah, blah, blah? You're not going to go share that. So that on its own still isn't enough. So the last thing they did was they abused this, loading it in an iframe, and then used some styling in there to hide everything on that little form except the actual share button itself, the done button, or I guess send is what it was called. And so they ended up creating a fake form. I think their example was they asked a question of like, what's the coolest horse? And it's got like a unicorn and a pony and some other stuff. And that is what was displayed to the end user. But the actual send button itself was still the send for the share form behind the scenes. And this is like a classic example of what a clickjacking attack looks like, where you trick the user into clicking something. They think they're submitting a form saying ponies are their favorite type of horse. In reality, clicking that send isn't submitting the horse form. It's submitting the share request and approving it for whatever that secret file was behind the scenes. So long story short, through like a chain of open redirects and weaknesses in the iframe options headers that let interactable forms get loaded in iframes, they were able to create a special Google Sheet where if you sent it to a victim with a file that you wanted to steal from them or steal access to, and an email address you wanted to use to share that access, by tricking them into filling out this little what's your favorite horse form and clicking send, it would share a arbitrary file with an arbitrary email address just through that one click. So it still requires some user interaction, but because of that clickjacking vulnerability, you could mask the interaction, which made this a pretty interesting vulnerability, I thought. And a great example of how you can actually weaponize chains of open redirects and clickjacking vulnerabilities into a meaningful attack against someone. And it earned them a bit over $4,000. That's pretty cool.
Very cool.
Yeah. If you want to check out the researcher and their blog, the domain is lyra.horse. That's lyra.horse as the TLD. They've got a few other interesting research posts on there too, but this one was pretty cool. It showed a good example of taking two low severity issues and turning them into something meaningful. But man, I guess wrapping up this episode, Corey, what do you think we're going to be banning next in the world of cybersecurity? Smart egg containers? You can pry that out of my cold, dead hands.
The Wi-Fi egg things you got for the fridge way back when we were looking at really stupid IoT devices. They can ban that as if they want. I don't care.
Oh no, I need my smart egg container.
Japanese computerized bidet toilets.
Now that
how will those be used to
disruption.
cyber attack us? Yeah,
Exactly.
I don't know. I'm still sad about my drones. I always DJI would just leave my video to me.
Well, maybe there will be a nice American alternative, or at least a country that we're still friends with.
Yeah, it only costs 4 times as much to do half as much.
That's the future we're in, unfortunately. Hey everyone, thanks again for listening. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you have any questions on today's topics or suggestions for future episode topics, you can reach out to us on Instagram. We're at watchguard_technologies. Thanks again for listening, and you will hear from us next week.
Callie says 5 stars only.
5 stars only, and scratch her, please.
She gets all the scritches for every 5-star we get.